All right, hello everyone. Welcome to the informational webinar 2 for the Climate Adaptation Partnerships FY24 Notice of Federal Funding Opportunity. I am Chelsea Combest-Friedman, and I'm the Director for the Climate Adaptation Partnerships, formerly RESA program. And with me, I have a number of our CAP team members here at the Climate Program Office at NOAA. So we also have on the call Sean Bath and Jeannie Bay, Jessica Garrison, and I'm not sure if we have Hannah Lohman on the call as well, but she may be joining us. We can move to the next slide, Jessica. Okay, so we are, as we did with the last informational webinar, we are recording this one, and you'll be able to watch it later if you want. You'll also get a copy of the slide deck, and so you'll be able to see the slides in the future. So outline for today's informational webinar, we'll just quickly go through an overview again of the program. We went through a little bit of that last time, so we'll try not to be repetitive, but give you some quick reminders that might be helpful for you in this stage of the proposal writing. Then we're going to talk a bit about the review process once you submit a full proposal and the evaluation criteria. We'll go into a little bit more detail on this webinar about the components of a full proposal and what those entail. And then hit on some of the main points that we provided as feedback to the letters of intent that were submitted, and provide a little bit of extra context, hopefully, for some of the feedback that was provided that hopefully you guys have received if you submitted an LOI. Next slide, please. You can go to the next one. Okay, so as a quick reminder, hopefully you have seen this graphic before. Climate Adaptation Partnerships Program's main goal is to advance equitable adaptation through sustained regional research and community engagement. The bulk of our funding is provided for regional teams that are 5-year cooperative agreements and composed of researchers and a variety of specialists in multi-state regions. So the FY24 NOFO are 2 competitions for regional teams in 2 additional regions. And on the right-hand side, you're looking at a graphic that came from work that we did a number of years ago to really co-develop with our network and an outside consultant a program theory for CAP. This kind of shows you what the CAP approach looks like in a high level way across all of the regional teams. So this program is very focused on the themes and the work of each of the teams being very led by the localities and the regions that they serve. Adaptation is very much a local, it happens at a local level, local to regional level. And so that's really what determines the exact type of work that each team works on. But this diagram is meant to sort of show what are the components that are part of a team in each region. It's not linear, so each of these components sort of work handily with each other at different stages of the process, but hopefully it gives you a sense of where we put emphasis both in the process and in terms of thinking about the outputs and the outcomes of this program. Next slide, please. So we currently have 13 full regional teams. Those are the areas that are shaded in colors on this map. And then we have 3 expansion geographies, which include 2 of the geographies that are being competed in the FY24 NOFO, the Southeast, the Upper Northeast, and the Central Appalachia region. Next slide, please. So as a reminder, the funding availability for these 2 competitions this year include $1,100,000 a year for 5 years for the core CAP team. Out of that amount, a minimum of $200,000 of the total budget over the 5 years should go to fund community-based organizations or local governments that are serving under-resourced frontline communities. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in detail later in the webinar. So in a nutshell, the total proposed cost for the 5-year proposal shouldn't be higher than $5,500,000, but we do encourage you to think about how you would use, very close to that full amount. In general, we find that that these are small amounts of resources for doing this work on the ground. Next slide, please. So this is an image of our program theory. The program theory looked at 3 scales of work. One, the scale at which the program management team at CPO NOAA works at, and what our sort of inputs and outputs and outcomes are. One at the regional level, so that the level at which the teams work, which is the one that you're looking at here. And then a third one that looked at what our outputs and outcomes are sort of as a broader network, thinking into the future about how we can have even more impact sort of as the sum of many wonderful regional parts. So I won't go into great depth on this now. As you can see, it's complicated and there's a lot to talk about here, but I did want to draw your attention to the fact that we do have a program theory, and it is available, at least this portion of the program theory is available on our website. And maybe if one of the team members wouldn't mind putting the link into the chat, we can make sure that you have that handy. The other thing I wanted to point out here that maybe isn't as obvious as you're sort of thinking about the nuts and bolts of putting these proposals together is to draw your attention to the next user adaptive actions way on the right-hand side of this diagram. Those are what we consider sort of the longer term outcomes that regional teams are aiming to have an impact on. So those are things like changing behaviors and practices, changing policies or guidance, changing rules, regulations, and standards, changing understanding, information use and attitudes, and changing budget allocations. And then you can kind of work back from there. Next slide, please. So we also wanted to just spend a minute drawing your attention to a really helpful chapter in the recently released National Climate Assessment. This chapter is the adaptation chapter, and I think we can probably put a link for the NCA in here as well, if somebody has a moment to do that. But you can find this online. You can find the whole NCA online, including the adaptation chapter. And we actually also suggest you look at the social justice chapter. I think it's actually social science and justice chapter. This particular chapter, the adaptation chapter, actually gives a definition for transformative adaptation. And since the NOFO talks a little bit about transformative adaptation, we wanted to point your attention here. In addition to having a definition, it also talks about the sort of how incremental and transformative adaptation happens in sort of it happens together. In other words, they're not mutually exclusive. You can see on here that you could maybe take a leap or a bound in terms of reaching a transformative result, or you could be taking a lot of very small kind of incremental steps and also reach transformation that way. So as you're sort of thinking through what transformative adaptation looks like in the context of your proposal and the work going on in your region, we thought this would be a helpful chapter to sort of bring some context to those terms. Sean, was there anything else you wanted to add on this slide?
I dropped the link into both chapters, but specifically key message 20.2, social system structure, how people know and communicate about climate change. There's a great graphic there on co-production in research. And I think maybe prior, in keynote 20.1, there is a graphic on governance. Both of these things, I think, color our perspectives on how the science relates to social impact in the regions. So take a look at both of those chapters if you want to get a good sense of how we're thinking in the literature that we're working off of.
Awesome. Thanks, Sean. And I think, I guess, to summarize here, or maybe just to conclude here, it would be helpful for applicants to think about how their work relates to the various adaptation pathways that will move society forward, both in that incremental and transformative space. Next slide, please. All right, so this is a text-heavy slide. Again, you will have these slides after the webinar, so I'm not going to go through each of these, but just to maybe pull out a few things that we notice over the years that really help to make team proposals for this program strong. One of the ones I wanted to hit on was balance. So we often get questions about, how much of this should be research, how much of this should be kind of more engagement focused or outreach focused. We don't have sort of percentages for, each of those categories. So we really encourage people to think about what balance makes sense for your regional context and for the kind of work that you'll be doing, that you'll be proposing to do in your region. And in some cases, there's a really good rationale, or there, are some really good juicy science questions that will advance adaptation, or advance the scalability of adaptation, let's say. But in other regions, there might be a heavier balance, or there might be a heavier emphasis on community engagement processes that are going to enhance the usability of information that's there, or that are going to bring a more diverse set of voices in that will help produce the kind of buy-in we need to advance adaptation. And so it really does depend on the region, of course. So we encourage you to think about sort of how you are balancing those various components and what the rationale is for them at the regional level. The other one that I wanted to point out, so there's sort of bullet 3 and 4 talk about applying knowledge to action and using a transdisciplinary science approach. This is, of course, really critical and kind of a cornerstone of what CAP funds. One of the things that we've seen, especially over time, is the increasing need to emphasize in regions how we, take the information that often informs planning and really think about implementation. So how we're helping communities and decision-making communities move, from the planning stage to the implementation stage. The other piece that I wanted to highlight in sort of this arena of these bullets is thinking closely about whose knowledge counts and whose knowledge tends to come forward, and how we allow multiple knowledge sources, some of them non-scientific, really into the discourse and the governance structure, if you will, of adaptation at this level. A couple of other things to point out here: the role of social sciences, as you've probably gathered in feedback we've given you thus far, is really important to this program. And that includes both the role that social sciences can play in helping to frame issues, but also in terms of actually helping to answer the questions that both decision-making and geographic communities have about adaptation and their own priorities for the future. Unsurprisingly, local expertise is really critical. So this program very much focuses on funding teams that are local experts in place. And so that we've emphasized that in multiple places, but just to emphasize that again. And then finally, on this slide, I wanted to just draw your attention, and we'll talk a little bit more about this when we get to the component stage, about the importance of really thinking through the program management structure for the team, and how that program management structure will allow for integration across all of the probably various portfolios of work that you'll have as a team. This is the piece that we find to be one of the hardest pieces for teams to kind of coalesce around, especially teams that haven't been working together before, which, we're obviously competing for new teams here. And so that's a piece that, I think as you're thinking through kind of what are the more researchy questions that you might be wanting to tackle in this work, definitely also give a lot of time and space to thinking about how you're going to manage this team and how you're going to ensure that this isn't sort of a separate, there aren't like a series of separate research projects going on here, that there's really sort of an integrative framework or model for this work. And part of that, an important part of that, is thinking through how you're going to evaluate not just the work that your team is doing, but if possible, thinking about how do you evaluate whether this is helping to advance adaptation in the communities with whom you're working, or generally in the region. Next slide. Okay, let me go through this next section, and then I'll pause and we can take some questions if there are any before we get too far down, because this will be a lot of information that we're sharing today. So I'll quickly go over the review process, and then we can talk a little bit about evaluation criteria. So once an applicant submits a full proposal to the program, we do start a review process that involves a panel review of the proposals. The panel reviews, the intent of the panel review, or the role of the panel review, is to evaluate both the technical merit of the proposals as well as the relevance of the proposals to the program and to the communities with whom you're proposing to work. The panelists, the panels, of course, are anything to do with the panel or who's involved in the panel. That's all confidential information, but we can share that we spend quite a bit of time thinking about the composition of these panels and really trying to ensure that we have a diverse set of perspectives at the table that represent a number of different disciplines, as these are, interdisciplinary proposals, and that include not just scientific perspectives, but also practitioner perspectives, perspectives of those who've worked closely with communities and have a deep expertise in community engagement or stakeholder engagement, and to the extent that we can, have a strong understanding of the regional context and the various topical contexts that are coming through the proposals. So all to say, we really spend a lot of time thinking about how to balance those various perspectives on the panel. Once the panelists provide us their assessments, then the program managers, the team that I've mentioned today, we make the final recommendations on funding to NOAA. Next slide, please. Okay, so this evaluation criteria is in the NOFO. Many of you have probably looked at it already, but we just wanted to spend a little bit of time walking through it. There are two big categories for evaluation. One of them is relevance, and the relevance score, the total relevance score is worth 40% of the total score, and it includes two components. The first criterion is looking kind of more broadly at the importance and relevance of the proposal to the CAPRISA program and the CAPRISA program's goals, but it also looks at really what's the importance and relevance to the questions that the proposal is proposing to address, and the various sort of the benefits to the various partners and decision makers and communities that are being proposed within that proposal. So it looks both at the relevance to program goals, but also kind of more broadly the relevance of the work to the goal of advancing adaptation at the more local and regional level. The second criterion within that broader relevance category looks specifically at justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion, and how the proposal has integrated what we call JEDI principles really throughout throughout the proposal, both in terms of, or all-encompassing in terms of how the research team is being composed, the project management framework, the methods and research, the community engagement process, and then the benefits that are being proposed or expected within the proposal. So that's where you'll hear us talk about the importance of JEDI throughout this webinar, and it comes up in different ways. This is where specifically it's evaluated. Next slide, please. So the second broad category is technical, and that's worth 60% of the total score for a proposal. And that's made up of three different components. The first is technical scientific merit, the second, overall qualifications of applicants, and the third, project costs. I'm guessing that these may be a little bit more familiar to people. The technical scientific merit is looking at whether especially the methods and the approach that are being proposed within the proposal, whether those are technically sound and whether they're appropriate. This is also a place where we encourage panelists to think about JEDI more in the context of the actual methods and approaches that are being applied. The overall qualifications of applicants, that's where the applicant team is evaluated. So does the applicant team generally have the expertise and the experience to successfully implement the proposed work? And then project costs, while this might look like it's a small percentage, and it is relatively a smaller percentage than some of these other components, I definitely encourage you not to forget the budget, because I think panelists find a lot of really critical information in the budget. And so we'll talk a little bit about what the budget components are later in the webinar, but just to pull out that there is actually an evaluation criterion that is specifically about project costs and budget. Next slide, please. So before you submit a proposal, a couple things you should make sure that your institution has done. One, that the institution's registered in SAM, and there's a link there if you need it. The SAM number needs to be provided when the proposal is submitted as part of the proposal. And then we have recently gone through a transition from in grants online platforms. So we used to use Grants Online, we now use ERA Commons. And so if the institution has not set up an account in ERA Commons, please do make sure that you've done that as soon as possible. Is that the last slide, Jessica, for that section? Great. So Sean, let me turn to you and just make sure I haven't forgotten anything in that section that I should be emphasizing.
No, we'll cover some other related things in the next one.
Great. Why don't we just pause and see if there are any burning questions about either sort of the overarching program description that I gave, the points about what makes strong proposals, or the review and evaluation criteria before we move on.
There are currently no submitted questions to that section.
Okay, great. Well, we can continue. I'll encourage folks to add their questions in. If, I know sometimes it takes a minute to type. So if you're thinking about something, please feel free to type your questions in ahead of time. And then when we get to the end of each section, I'll pause so we can take the questions as we go as well. And we'll leave some time at the end for general questions once we've finished the presentation. So the next section we're going to go through, it looks at sort of these different proposal components in a little bit more detail. Next slide, Jessica. All right, so again, this is all information from the Notice of Federal Funding Opportunity. So you do have this already. The full proposals, as a reminder, are due on February 5th, 2024, in a few months by 5 p.m. Eastern time. And we have through Grants.gov here, but let me ask the team, I think is it still the same website now that we have ERA Commons?
It's still through Grants.gov, yeah.
Okay, perfect. So I'm not going to go through each of these proposal components on this slide, but one thing I wanted to just draw your attention to, the abstract. The abstract does become part of the public record in a slightly different way if the proposal is funded. So it sort of sits in the grant system in a more searchable database. So as you're thinking about writing the abstract, just keep that in mind, that it is it should be written in a way that's, of course, very understandable and clear, but also maybe for a more public audience than some other aspects of the proposal. I think we can go to the next slide. We'll cover a few of these key areas as we go through. Sean, was there anything else that you wanted to cover? I think I just covered this one.
Actually, something should have mentioned earlier. For those of you who have a control panel showing up, I know that GoToWebinar sometimes looks a little bit different for everyone, but there should be a control panel somewhere or a section that says handouts. And under the handouts, we have attached the notice of funding opportunity, the NOFO. We have the information sheet, which is an attachment add-on to the NOFO. And we have the letter of intent response feedback attachment, which it compiles all feedback for the LOIs. So each of those three we've been referencing them, we'll continue to reference them throughout this entire thing, and they're easily, you can easily download them through the platform itself, but they're also, I think, well, the information sheet and the NOFO are definitely on the website, and we're working on getting the LOI feedback attachment on as well, but you should have received it if you submitted an LOI. And we did get a question about how do you read the responses to the LOI when it says modifications? It's kind of hard to understand if it's encourage or discourage. And I think the answer to that, for full transparency, we ended up splitting responses into some subtle middle ground, I suppose. We normally have three categories. We have a encourage, discourage, and actually we normally have a maybe. That's because our proposals are rather complicated and we want to encourage specific revision of specific components if we think that they're really important for the relevance. In this particular competition, we actually split it into 4 categories. We did kind of a two maybe categories. One that was more, I think it says substantial modifications, and another that just says modifications. So if you're looking for sort of where it ranks in terms of that, then look out for those words. If it was just an encourage, then that's really very much on the right track when it comes to the relevance aspects of the proposal or the letter of intent. But either way, the way that we're evaluating that, we're not, we tried to avoid discouraging really as many as possible because we want to give the opportunity for substantial revisions that fit within the program if we think it's possible. And however, as we'll continue to discuss, that there's a particular balance of activities that make a good CAPRISA team, and we've seen a lot of these competitions where a lot of the rankings in the panel review can really be decided based on how well some of those major components are covered. So when we say modifications, whether it's substantial or we just say modifications, these sorts of things are really what we're thinking of. And we're going to cover them certainly in a little bit more in the next section. And especially with this slide in particular, thinking about the information that you put down in the proposal phase will be super important. There's nothing more sad, I suppose, than seeing a proposal that has good ideas but is sort of challenged by it not being very searchable or just not having like the same summative table of who the team members are and who the institutions are, and therefore the panel just can't wrap their head around it quite as easily. So make sure that you sort of have those very basic aspects and make sure that it's searchable so that that part isn't what isn't what the panel is struggling with, so that they can actually engage with your ideas and think about the connection to outcomes. I think that's all I'll say for the moment.
Okay, great. Thanks, Sean. Yeah, that also, as you were talking, Sean, I was thinking It says here list of team members and institutions, which is very helpful. I think it's also really helpful in the proposal to very clearly articulate, whether it's through a table or some other, easily visible way, to really articulate the roles of different people in the work that's being done, and the expertise of the different team members, right? Because these tend to be teams that are put together with a huge array of kind of expertise. And so as panelists are trying to evaluate the proposal, if they have an easy way to kind of check on, okay, what expertise is being provided to any given component of the proposal, that can help things along quite a bit. So I just want to emphasize again Sean's point about making, kind of thinking about the use of summarizing visuals, however you would like to put that together, that allows people at a glance to get a really clear vision of, who is who's working on what, and what skills they bring to that. All right, I think we can move to the next slide, Jessica. Awesome. Okay, so this is the meat of the proposal right here, the statement of work. We pulled out these 4 components from the NOFO: identification of the problem or issue, description of the projects, expected outcomes, societal benefits. And we wanted to dig in a little bit here because we know that these might be terms that a lot of different agencies or programs use, and they can mean subtly but maybe importantly different things in some of those different contexts. So as you're thinking through the identification of the problem/issue section, we're really interested in making sure that the proposals well articulate what the sort of climate impacts on people are in that region. So this program, the sort of ethos of this program is kind of start with the people and bring climate in as it makes sense. So really honing in on what does climate mean for people in this region? How are they being impacted? The justification of regional relevance. It's been very helpful in the past to be very articulate about what has already been done in this area. So on adaptation or whatever topic you might be, thinking about within the context of adaptation, what's already been done, who are some of the key players. These tend to be, regions, in most cases, the regions, tend to be pretty complex in terms of the partners involved, and we know there are other large funding sources out there for this kind of work. So articulating, again, what's been done and what are sort of the next steps or the key gaps that the team is proposing to advance, kind of building on that. And then the third piece, we've talked about this before, making sure that the approach of the team is well articulated in terms of how it's integrated and how the team members will work together. All right, description of projects. So one thing that has been very helpful, again, in the past, in this part of the proposal, as you're describing sort of the different components of your work or projects, however you're defining that, to think about trying to hit on each of these items as you develop that description. What are the goals and objectives of the work? What's the proposed methods or approach? What's the relevance to the communities or the beneficiaries, if you will? What are the strategies for engagement that are being employed? Who else is a part of the work? Who's partnering with the team on this work? And then kind of so what? Why does this matter, and how is it relevant to the overall goal of advancing equitable adaptation? The third category, expected outcomes. This is where we're really looking for an answer to the question of how is the work moving either the field or adaptation implementation forward in the region, and how are you measuring success? How do we know that we actually are doing what we say we're doing there? And one of the things that maybe doesn't come out as clearly always in this, or maybe it's just a scale issue, is we're very interested not just in the outcomes of the project. So as you're thinking about sort of project outputs or even kind of program evaluation, but also what are the outcomes at a regional level? So how is this really advancing adaptation for the region or for, let's say, a decision-making community, a broader community within the region. And then for societal benefits, how do we expect that we will see change here, or what changes do we expect to see around societal decisions and processes, and to be as specific as possible about the anticipated benefit for communities. I think in a lot of this work, we don't necessarily know exactly what the benefits will be, and that's okay. But we do at least want to be have some thoughts about what we're testing and be open to the idea that those might change over time as we learn more, or that we might be, searching for some unanticipated benefits. Sean, anything to add on this slide?
Yes, I would encourage everyone to try very intentionally to balance the statement of work being at a conceptual framing where you're thinking very big picture about what you're doing, thinking about the structure and all of these aspects, you're thinking about them in a conceptual way at a high level. Balancing that with specificity about projects, partners, and the research, et cetera. Obviously, there won't be full specificity, the type of the nature of this work itself, the fact that it's over 5 years, the fact that we want a lot of engagement with communities, we want those processes to be set up. So it's not that we're expecting you to list every partner that you intend to work with. In fact, and I think what some of that specificity could be is what I like to call welcome speculation, particularly when it comes to societal benefits. And I think that's just something that a lot of us in science aren't well practiced at, but thinking about how some of this very specific ways that you expect the science to relate to society, to benefit communities, there will be some speculation in that necessarily, but spelling that out helps the panel. But you'll want to balance both of that specificity that you're mentioning with the conceptual framing, because I've seen both cases, both extremes, where a panelists have looked at a proposal and they have found it either too conceptual and haven't mentioned enough specifics, or they have found it just a series of projects that don't seem to relate into an integrated whole. So keep an eye on that and try your best to balance both of those aspects.
Great, thank you. Next slide. Okay, so the next couple of slides are about the JEDI statement, Justice, Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion statement. I mentioned before that this comes up in various ways across the proposal. We do expect that you are thinking about JEDI across the proposal so that it will be included in your statement of work in whatever way that makes sense, depending on how you're addressing JEDI and incorporating it into the work. But we also wanted to have a standalone statement where you're able to sort of articulate maybe a more, able to more clearly articulate your approach to JEDI and kind of pull that out in one space. So here are some components that are included in the JEDI statement, and this comes again from the NOFO. Sean, I think you wanted to make a point here about the how we identify JEDI-related communities. Am I correct?
Yes. So we define frontline communities as those communities who are most vulnerable to and will be the most adversely affected by climate change and inequitable actions because of systemic and historical socioeconomic disparities, environmental injustices, or other forms of injustice. So the term that is used within the Justice 40 framework is disadvantaged communities. We tend to use frontline communities, or sometimes frontline communities and underserved communities, but we're essentially talking about the same thing, that you can make a case that the community is particularly disadvantaged or underserved in some context, that therefore justifies their inclusion within a justice and equity framework. There are tools, many tools that exist to identify these communities geographically or sometimes categorically. We are open to both geographic and non-geographic justifications of a community's inclusion. So, a non-geographic justification might be that you're working with a categorical type. So one that has come up before is like immigrant, undocumented farm workers, or something like that. So they're not necessarily in a specific place that you're working with, but they're across the region, and you're working with that with them as a category. In terms of geographic definitions, there are many more tools to identify them, and of course the prominent is CGIST, which is the climate, environmental justice, or maybe it's economic justice screening tool, which is officially sponsored by the White House and the main one used under Justice 40. You can use that. It is not a perfect tool, as no tool is. So you may find that you actually are more keen to use another tool, and we have specifically referenced also Headwaters Economics' rural capacity map, and then also FEMA's trying to remember the acronyms on the fly, Community Disaster Resilience Zones, which has officially been announced recently as a national policy. So you can use any of these tools, but you don't have to specifically rely on any one of them, even CGIST.
Next slide, please. Okay, the other piece of this NOFO that we want to draw some attention to, and this is actually new, we have not had this in any NOFO previously, is a required frontline community investment. We want this to be pulled out and articulated in the statement of JEDI, but of course this will probably come through in your statement of work and in your budget as well. And so the requirement here is that a minimum of $200,000 across the full funding for the 5 years has to be set aside to directly fund community-based organizations or local governments that are serving frontline communities. I know that a number of you probably have looked at previous teams and what they're up to, and so small grants to community-based organizations is something that we have piloted in this program, and something that we have ongoing. We have a number of small grant programs that are part of a number of CAP teams across the country, but we have also learned that sometimes having that kind of competition can be challenging. It can be challenging in terms of capacity to actually compete, and it can also be challenging in terms of reaching the kinds of frontline community organizations that teams might want to reach. And so we have tried to keep this as flexible as possible, which is why there's a requirement to spend the money, but not a requirement on how it has to be spent. So it does not have to be spent in a competitive process. We are leaving sort of the approach to how the funding is used and is administered up to the teams as they're proposing. But it is important to really think through how some funding is being given directly to, as we said, community-based organizations or local governments in this case. And we've broadened it to local governments because we know that in some places in the country, local governments really may be the ones that are serving the role that CBOs are serving in other parts of the country or even parts of the region. I know we're getting kind of tight on time, so I'm going to move us along unless, Sean, you had something else to point out about this. Okay, let's move to the next slide then. Oh, Sean, you're on for these two.
Sure. So a required component across all NOAA grants is the data information and sharing plan. It is included in the total list of proposal components, but I just wanted to note that that section in the actual list in the NOFO is rather short, but it references a section towards the end of the NOFO that has a series of administrative policies for NOAA, and that's where it goes a little bit more into what is included in the data and information sharing plan, so check that out. This is mainly a NOAA-wide plan for environmental data and information, and the idea that any NOAA-funded environmental data should be discoverable and accessible to the general public. This is the definition, their definition of environmental data and information. And I'll want to know, we're not usually in the business of creating some of this core physical data in our awards, but it does say correlative data such as socioeconomic data is included as well. And that's about all it says on that. So it's a little bit vague and it isn't really defined much more in the policy, but we have had some conversations around it and heard that there is an understanding that that does include a lot of social data that's out there. But this policy is so oriented towards the discoverable and accessible part that I just wanted to make sure that everyone understands that there are inherent exceptions here in the context where it would not make sense to be pushed to publish or share the data. So the obvious one is human subjects research, that if you have to get institutional review board approval in order to collect data from people and there's a sensitivity of that data, then we are not expecting you to then make that information public. Another context that has come up a lot is Indigenous data sovereignty. When you're working with, in the context that it is born out of, it is born, from working with actual sovereign Indigenous nations that really deserve to have ownership over the data that they produce, that they create or co-create with Western style scientists. And our policy is not intended to, ruin that arrangement or to prevent the researcher from making a custom-built arrangement where that data can be sort of continually owned by those who create it. So that concept bleeds in a little bit. We don't necessarily have a huge practice across the board of doing the same thing with Indigenous data sovereignty that we do with community owned or local data, but that concept is one that NOAA and we as program managers would see and understand the justification for not automatically making it public. Next slide. And this I wanted to just include and make sure that it is here on a slide. This is the components of the data management plan that's shared in the administrative section of the NOFO, specifically that's on page 26. And these are the sorts of things that they ask for, but if it's not particularly relevant to what we're doing in these awards, then this section can be relatively light. But it is a component of the evaluation criteria, so I would not ignore it entirely. And then lastly, just as a note, as a part of this policy, this is something that becomes more relevant later on when you're funded, but just know that all pre-publication manuscripts that are intended for publication later should be submitted to the NOAA institutional repository. That's part of this overall data policy. Next slide.
Okay, so a couple more components, and then I'm going to turn things to Sean. We only have about 9 minutes left. So if there are questions that are coming up, please include them. Please write them into the questions section here, and we will try to address them before we hit the top of the hour. We can stay on a little bit as well. So there's also a required component now for describing your project management plan. Again, this is pulled directly from the NOFO, so I won't go into this here in depth, only to emphasize again that this is a really important component of the proposal, and please do spend some time thinking about how the program team is going to communicate and make decisions together. And we have found it to be particularly successful in teams over time when they have a dedicated staff time, usually full time, but at least close to full time, for sort of the general program management role. And though different teams have defined that differently. Sometimes they call it a program coordinator, a program manager, a program director, but basically somebody whose main job is to really do that program management and integration. Next slide. Okay, letters of institutional commitment. A letter of institutional commitment is something that we look for. Every institution is in a different place in terms of what they might be able to support for a CAP team, and so we don't evaluate There's no ding on the proposal if your institution isn't providing, like, let's say, additional funding or something of that nature. So this isn't meant to be a way to overly benefit certain institutions that might be more supportive of like transdisciplinary work, but it is an effort to support the teams in talking to their institutions about what services or support might an institution be able to provide, and to make sure that the institution is buying in at some level to the kind of work that the CAP team is proposing. We know that this is relatively a small amount of money compared to some of the other federal funding sources, so we're not, we take that into account, but we hope that this offers an opportunity for the team to really push the institution to think about whether there are some ways that that the institution can support the team. So again, flexible in terms of what that support looks like. It does not need to be funding specifically. Next slide, please. Additional letters of support are not required, but it is an option, and you can include up to 10 letters. Those can be letters from potential partners. We would encourage you to think about those letters coming from partners with whom you already have some agreement. One of the reasons that we have limited letters of support is because we don't want to overburden community partners in particular with having to provide letters of support, and that perhaps kind of leading to an expectation that work will happen without there being sufficient time to actually engage them properly and really come to a shared understanding. So it's sort of hopefully a way to not encourage harm here inadvertently. Sean, anything else that we really need to mention on this? I'm just trying to move us along.
I would just recommend you take a look at the information sheet, specifically 2 sections, developing partnerships in new and current CAP teams, and partners would go more into depth about our logic with building relationships and with partners.
Awesome. Next slide, please. Okay, and then I think we touched on this earlier. Don't forget the budget, don't forget the budget table and narrative. Those are really important components of the proposal, and where panelists often get a lot of information. I think we've touched on most of these things. One thing to point out here is that the $200K for the frontline community investment should be really clearly identified in the budget. If, for whatever reason, the categories make that difficult, make sure it's really well identified in the project, in the budget narrative, where you can maybe be a little bit more explicit. I think that's all we need to say here. Sean, anything else?
Just a reminder to scope the budget closely to the full amount and try to keep that even-ish year to year as much as possible. You don't get any advantage from coming in significantly under budget. Instead, we sort of expect that is the amount, like we should scope the work to the amount of the full budget.
Great, thank you. Next slide. Here's just a listing of the federal budget forms that are required. Your sponsored research office probably has those. One kind of quick clarification point, because this always comes up, because this is a 5-year award and the budget forms are only set up to be 4 years, you do need to have 2 of them, basically, one that will detail the annual budget from years 1 through 4, and then another one that's identical, you just fill out a second one, that would have the year 5 and then the total for all 5 years. Next slide. Okay, I'm turning to you, Sean.
Yes. Okay, so these are going to be a few things that are already covered under the LOI feedback, but I just want to hit some major highlights of some of the major points. So first of all is the geographic scope. There is a lot said in the information sheet about determining geographic scope, so please do check that, review that section. Proposals with institutions and core partners in only one state will not be competitive. We want to repeat that. It's sometimes a little bit a perspective thing, because it's whatever component the panel can see, and the most visible is the set of institutions and partners that is on the core team. And then it also rolls over to what partners there are and what projects you plan in different regions. But think about what's built into specificity now and how that represents you across a geographic area. We don't necessarily expect you to have a strong game in every single state of your region right off the bat, but having them in only one region will be a problem for sure. So there's some specific guidance per region, but honestly, they're pretty generic, except for this section in the covering the Southeast that talks about how we are particularly interested in seeing institutional representation in Alabama and or Mississippi. That institutional representation, as we've mentioned before, could come as a community-based organization partner or something like that. It doesn't necessarily have to be science or research, but we are coming from the perspective that we see Florida and Georgia as much more likely to have a lot of institutional opportunities in their region, and we want to make sure that in that particular geography we have a team, that the funded team is one that covers also into Alabama and Mississippi. And then lastly, as we've mentioned before and in the first webinar, we're expecting a coastal and inland balance. But we want to really highlight this again, that any proposal that comes in that's exclusively coastal, it will not be deemed relevant. We have a lot of other coastal resources at NOAA, and this particular program is about the entire region, and it is important to us that it covers an inland geography. But a coastal geography is okay, just as long as the overall focus is balanced and includes the inland as well. Next slide. So, oops. Okay, still unmuted. So integrated science, this is a core component. We have mentioned this a lot, so I won't go too much further into this, but maybe just say for now that the way that you show the competence across disciplines is to display that simple list of team members and what their expertise is. It's important to have that in the CV, but you don't want the panelists to have to look in the CV in order to see it. You want something more simple that they can just sort of glide over and see where that expertise is. I would say that it's particularly important to think what kind of social scientist you have on the team, right? Like, make sure that you have somebody that actually has that experience, and then also make sure that you have a climate scientist, a physical climate scientist, and don't lose that aspect either. But aside from that, there are a lot of specific mixes of disciplines and knowledge sets that you could get into, and we absolutely encourage you to be creative about that. Next slide. Covering multiple hazards and issues is another important aspect here, and this is a little bit hard to communicate because I think that there are a lot of issues and projects that can be submitted that still have a multi-hazard focus or a multi-issue focus within climate context, but still aren't quite what we're looking for. So I just want to express that we are expecting, think about it from the perspective of we're trying to get a CAP RISA team in the region that looks like our other CAP teams, which usually that means that they have a set of different issues or categories that they cover, and there's a certain flexibility in both the expertise that they have and the work that they're doing, that if something came up that's related to one of those topics, they could shift and focus on something else. So it's not necessarily a discrete set of projects that remains the same over the entire course of the 5 years. You might have that within your proposal, but you also need to show that you have a flexibility to work across, the issue areas that you're proposing the team will focus on. So I think what we've seen here, we don't necessarily see complete single hazard focused proposals quite as much anymore. There are some, but think about it from the perspective of if it's just focused on flooding, for example, it's focused on flooding, but it includes several aspects of flooding and the societal impacts of that. That's great. That's on the right track, but that might still be one strain of what a CAP RISA does. And I think I covered that well. So next slide. Oh, I saw the one thing before we changed over. It is possible that you might pitch too much. So this is yet another aspect of balance. Make sure that if you are throwing out a lot on the table, that you don't worry the panelists into, are they going to be able to handle all of these things at once? Don't spread yourself too thin, in other words. Have multiple strains, but then have a reasonable plan for how to integrate all of that. Okay, and this one is another one that's been common throughout everything that we've been saying. This really harkens back in particular to the logic model that Chelsea showed earlier, part of our program theory that you'll see on the characteristics of a successful CAPRISA team page. If we can drop the link in the chat for that again, that would be helpful. So thinking about that logic model and thinking about the sort of adaptive capacity outcomes that builds the adaptive capacity of the partners and decision makers and community-based organizations that we're working with, and helps them to make better choices, helps them to make different policies and different budgets and different different resource decisions that are ultimately the bread and butter of adaptation. That's what this is all about. So make sure that you don't lose perspective in that. We're often quite skeptical if we just see a tool or a model pitched as something that will sort of be a magic bullet in the work with communities. We want that justified explicitly if there is a focus on a tool or a model. And we want it justified in a way that really relates and includes the communities that are at the center of all of this. Next slide. And this is more on the same topic, really. The partnerships themselves are evaluated in the context of how the work helps them address issues, and not by how it makes them aware of the data and the tools. So again, see the developing partnerships section in the information sheet. Next slide. We've mentioned this concept as well quite a bit, and this can help address some of those issues with if you're trying to relate to those outcomes and push adaptation forward. One really solid way of doing that is to find a great find a community-based organization that can be such a central partner that you actually, for example, include them in the team. I mean, all of our experts we expect in the team, at least most of them, we expect them to be in the region themselves, embedded in the physical place, but also, close by enough to be able to go to regional meetings and participate in some of the processes of decision makers. But even better if you can actually get the people that are non-research partners and embed them into the team. Some of our teams have even embedded them within the governance team of the CAP team itself. So that creates really a deeper opportunity for co-production. I'm not saying you should just rush into that though, because it does obviously require the right partner. We won't expect you to do that. You want to go a little bit carefully into that, because a partner at that scale that you would want to integrate into the core team, you'd want them to have a big picture perspective on the region. But nevertheless, they can really help. Another thing to think about is the advisory committee. A lot of teams embed or engage in advisory committees where they bring together a few of the people that might fit that kind of description, where they're community partners or local decision makers throughout the region. And having a good plan for how you manage that advisory committee can be another way that how you manage the advisory committee and how you help make the advisory committee direct your work can also be another way to address this. Next slide. All right, and that's actually the end of that section. This is a reminder of all of our major links. The funding opportunity page on our website. I just want to remind everyone that you may need to actually click through the drop-down menus on that website to find everything available. That drop-down menu system has fooled me on a number of occasions where I can't find the thing that I'm looking for. So just make sure that you just look through everything on that web page and try to find, maybe honestly download like our attachments, download the documents and then keep them closer at hand. We have a direct link to the full notice of funding opportunity, the Grants.gov listing, the information sheet, which is also attached. Frequently asked questions on our website is also another way that we add new questions that we've gotten over the course of the competition from our email, and we've given answers to it. And then the common characteristics of a successful CAPRISA team talks not only about the program theory using that logic model, but also has some sections about the different governance aspects of the team. For example, we mentioned the advisory committees, we mentioned the program manager or program coordinator concept. Those are listed on that page. And next slide. Yeah, and we will continue to populate the calendar with office hours. Please sign up for them. It should be working now. It wasn't working immediately when we sent the LOI feedback, but there should be some dates scheduled now for you to talk to us about the LOI if you'd like to, and talk about their other plans for the full proposal. And then you can always send an email and we'll try to get back to you as quickly as possible. And we can, I suppose, take questions if we've still got time to stay on, Chelsea.
Yeah, why don't we, as a team, we can stay on for a little bit, but I know we're over time, so if folks need to drop off, that's more than fine. Apologies for going a bit over today, but if there are questions, please feel free to put them, I guess, in the questions box or in the chat, however you're able to.
We do have one question, Chelsea, asking, will you be looking at including local/regional governments as partners in the proposal?
So that is an option. Sorry, repeat the question, as partners?
Yes, as partners in the proposal.
Yeah, so frequently those sorts of partners are are included in a proposal as a partner. And there's somewhat of a distinction, I guess. Partner is kind of a complicated word and that it can mean different things to different people, but we sort of distinguish like who's on the PI team, if you will, like so who's part of the CAP team, and then who are the partners who you're working with. So they're not maybe directly funded necessarily, but they're partnering with you on the work. And so that's probably most commonly where we would see local governments.
To add to that, obviously there's a finite amount of funding, so who would be on the core team and actually funded even a little bit might be a smaller set of people. But sometimes I have seen strategically somebody on the payroll, even if it's a small token amount or a more significant amount, but I've seen sometimes there being like one person that's like well represented or well integrated to local and regional governments as an example, or they're part of an association or an organization that represents multiple or a coalition of local governments. That has been a common thing that we have seen, and that helps a lot for them to be integrated, in the team meetings, in the regular business, or at least to be able to see all of that happen and dip in and out as makes sense. So that they can be the sort of spokesperson or the voice and the connector to that stakeholder group. But it really does require a little bit of thinking about who or what type of organization or what type of person even is like really well tuned to thinking at the regional scale versus you only have so many budget slots that you would give to try to include local and regional governments. Those might instead be a well-organized group of stakeholders and partners that you have that you still do a lot with, and maybe you even include their names on your website later or whatever, but you wouldn't necessarily have the funds to support them all.
That was our only submitted question. So right now we've answered them all that we have.
Okay, thanks, Jessica. Why don't we'll stay on for like maybe 2 more minutes just in case anything else comes in or in case somebody is writing something right now. But as a reminder, you will have these slides. We have the office hours set up if additional questions come up as you're preparing your proposal. And of course, there are a lot of resources on the website as well. So I just want to thank everybody again for taking the time to be with us today and for your interest in the program. We know that this is a really tough kind of proposal to write. We ask for a lot of different components, and it's complex work on the ground. And so it's like progress, not perfection in all of this. Hopefully the advice and the insights and the ideas that we put forward today are helpful to you as you think through how this is meaningful in your own context and in your own region. Do we have any other questions, Jessica? If not, I think we'll just close out.
We do not.
Okay, all right. Anything else? Any last words from you, Sean?
Nope, we'll be in touch.
Great. Okay, thanks everyone again. Have a wonderful rest of your day. Bye-bye.
Bye.